But first tonight, the growing controversy over the tragic death of Savita Halappanavar in Galway University Hospital. Just 24 hours after it was announced, the HSE inquiry into her death is in disarray. Her husband, Bhriain Halappanavar, is still calling for a public inquiry, and this despite the changes in the investigation team. It's not at all clear whether or not he, as one of the chief witnesses, will participate with any HSE inquiry. But whatever the eventual findings, Savita Halappanavar's death has already transformed the abortion debate in Ireland. Katie Hannon reports.
It's now clear that the 1983 amendment to the Constitution allows for limited abortion in Ireland. The judges have said, a majority of judges have said, that where there's a real and substantial risk to the life of the mother, a pregnancy can be terminated.
20 years after Alan Shatter described the Supreme Court judgment on the X case in those terms, there is still no legislation on the statute books to reflect that position. In 2010, the European Court of Human Rights demanded action, and this government papered over their ideological cracks on this issue by establishing an expert group to advise on what form this action should take. But just as the group's report landed on the minister's desk, news of a heartrending tragedy would transform the debate.
Good morning at 7 o'clock on Wednesday the 14th of November on RT Radio 1.
Today, an investigation into the death of a pregnant woman in a Galway hospital.
The Irish Times account of how Savita Halappanavar, a young Indian woman, had died of septicemia, having repeatedly requested a termination for her doomed pregnancy, has had a truly extraordinary impact that reverberated around the world.
Well, I think what we've seen in the last several days in Ireland has been firstly a huge outpouring of public sympathy and sadness for the very tragic death of Savita in Galway. But running simultaneously with that, we have seen a really shrill, hysterical outbursts from abortion campaigners, and I must say from elements of the Irish media, who have sought to use this tragedy in order to further their own agenda. We've had sight of an email which shows very clearly that pro-choice organisations had prior knowledge of the case before it became public, and that they were meeting to plan how to best use Savita's death in order to proceed with their campaign to have abortion legalised in Ireland.
Galway Pro-Choice has acknowledged that they put Savita's husband in touch with the Irish Times journalist who broke the story, but say they did so at his request.
Well, I initially got a phone call on Saturday the 3rd of November from a friend of Savita's, and he just said that he wanted to speak with me about a tragic incident at the hospital in Galway. And then he sent us a further email with more details on the case, and 3 days later we met with 10 of Savita's friends, and they told us all the details of the case and said to us that they wanted our help in making sure that this never happened to any woman ever again.
Galway Pro-Choice members are adamant that the decision to go public was entirely Savita's husband's alone, and that any reputational damage to the country is fully deserved.
I would say that we absolutely deserve to have our reputation blackened. It's our archaic laws regarding abortion that creates this grey situation where doctors don't know how they're supposed to act, and it's just inevitable that something like this will happen when you have this impossible situation for doctors, and we should be ashamed of ourselves.
The HSE's inquiry into what happened in Galway University Hospital was in disarray this evening after the Health Minister demanded that 3 consultants from the hospital be removed from the 7-member inquiry team. And Bhriain Halappanavar refused to cooperate, saying he will only have confidence in a fully independent public inquiry.
If there is any sort of apprehension in the public domain, and certainly from the family of any involved in any sort of investigation or inquiry of this nature, then I think then in that sense that justice must be seen to be done, and those members should be absolutely their credibility and independence and impartiality could not be questioned.
But tonight, the revelation that the chairman of the inquiry team has written an academic paper on reproductive rights has raised yet more concerns. The paper states, "We would like to challenge and encourage societies and countries with restrictive abortion laws to look at the evidence available in favour of liberal abortion laws and debate the possibility of making the choice of termination of pregnancy a legal right for women." Niamh Bhriain of the Life Institute told Primetime that Mr Errol Cumaran's views will lead people to have serious questions about his ability to be impartial in the inquiry.
Protecting the health and life of a pregnant woman is not...
Tomorrow, pro-choice Labour deputies will once again be asked to vote against ex-case legislation that they believe is long overdue, this time proposed by Sinn Féin. When this issue was last debated in the Dáil last April, they took heart from a surprisingly forthright declaration from the Minister for Health.
No action has been taken by 6 successive governments. Well, I can assure you this will not be the 7th.
This sparked uproar within Fine Gael's Conservative flank. While events of the past week have shifted thinking in Fine Gael on the issue, there's no doubting the gap that still exists within the coalition.
This is a matter that has divided Irish society now for a great number of years, and I'm not going to be rushed into a situation by force of numbers on any side.
We are going to take action on this. Doing nothing on this issue is not an option.
Having mounted a massive campaign to warn TDs of the perils of legislating for the X case over the summer, there is obvious dismay within the pro-life campaign that all their hard work may be fundamentally undermined by the Savita tragedy.
Well, I think there's no doubt that people have responded in huge numbers to the pro-life campaigns that we've been running. You know, one estimate is that it's up to 66,000 phone calls have been made to Fine Gael TDs in the past 5 months on this issue. I think when you are perhaps in the middle of a public controversy, it is difficult to see where politicians stand. I think that when matters become more clearer and people have a better understanding of what happened, and I think when people in particular realise that Ireland's pro-life laws do not contribute to the deaths of women, then there will be that political shift will move back.
Pro-choice campaigners, meanwhile, have been bowled over by the surge of support they've noted in the wake of this story.
The difference between how many people are now talking about it now as opposed to a few months ago is remarkable. And I think that people have become extremely angry and they're not going to rest until something changes.
Those changes are likely to be contained in the expert group report, which James Riley says he will bring to Cabinet next Tuesday. Primetime understands that the report outlines a framework which would set out clearly when, where and under what circumstances a woman is entitled to have a lawful abortion in this state. This would be in cases where the risk to the mother's life was deemed to be real by 2 clinicians, probably of consultant level. Where pregnant women denied this procedure would be entitled to a right of appeal. That such appeals would be conducted speedily by appropriate specialists, and that abortions would only be allowed in hospitals approved by the Minister for Health. Any attempt to put this regime on a statutory footing will outrage anti-abortion campaigners, who fear a blurring of the line between direct and indirect abortions.
If an intelligent solution is going to be given to balancing the competing rights of the child and of the mother, we'll have to pay attention to that distinction in a way that the Supreme Court didn't in the X case. And as long as we're trying to legislate in line with the X case, we're going to be stuck with a definition which isn't sensitive to that important distinction. And it's a distinction that is in place in current medical practice in Irish hospitals.
But as the debate rages on the rights and wrongs of enshrining the X case judgment into legislation or regulations, a key question arises. Even if the X case was on the statute books, would it protect the life of a woman in cases where the moment at which her life, as opposed to her health, is at risk, is a matter of fine clinical judgment?
There's an obvious need for something that goes a little bit beyond the X case, because it seems at least possible, without prejudging the outcomes of any inquiries, that the X case would not have caught the situation in which Galway Hospital found itself. As a result of that, one at least wonders whether in a situation where there is no hope for the fetus, whether the balance would switch in favour of the mother far earlier than the scenario in which a significant threat to her life has emerged.
Meanwhile, with confirmation tonight that the changes to the Galway inquiry team has failed to satisfy Bhriain Halappanavar, it appears the difficulties for the government with this issue have only just begun.
And that was Katie Hannon reporting. Now, we did invite a government spokesperson, but none were available this evening. I am joined in studio by Billy Kelleher from Fianna Fáil, his spokesperson on health, by Dr Barry Kiely, the medical advisor to the pro-life campaign, and by obstetrician Peter Boylan. And we're also joined from London by Roger Clements, a retired consultant obstetrician. Peter Boylan, if I can ask you first, as a practising obstetrician here in Ireland, what are the key questions that need to be answered by this inquiry?
Well, the first point is that where there's a clear risk to a mother's life, termination of pregnancy is not an issue, and that happens in Irish hospitals, and nobody objects to that, and there's no discussion about it. Just get on with it. Where we have problems is where the threat to the mother's life is not that apparent. And in those cases where there's a risk, a serious risk to her health, which might result in her death, but it's not clear at all, what happens now is that the woman goes to England and has a termination of pregnancy and comes back and has her treatment as she wishes. The other point is that women's views on the relative risk to her life is not taken into account. So, for example, people's perception of risk is very different. If you've got a condition, say, like Eisenmenger syndrome, which is a very serious congenital heart disease, which has a 50% mortality rate, you may think that that's a very high rate or a very high risk, and you would wish to have a termination of pregnancy. On the other hand, you may say, well, look, that's not such much a risk at all. You may have somebody else who's got a risk of, say, 20% where you might die as a consequence.
Can I bring you to, I mean, obviously we do not know the facts of this case, but from what we have heard, this woman appears to have died of infection. She presented at 17 weeks pregnancy. She appears to have been told that it was a definite miscarriage that was going to happen, that the fetus wasn't viable. Is that always the case? Can a fetus at 17 weeks survive?
Yes, in circumstances where the waters go at 17 weeks pregnancy, what would happen in other jurisdictions is that the woman would be explained, it would be explained to her that the baby has very little chance of survival, but it has a chance of survival. If the woman, say, has an if it's an IVF pregnancy, she's in her 40s and it's a very precious to her, then every effort will be made to continue that pregnancy on right up until, and it could go on 34, 38 weeks and result in a perfectly healthy baby. The chances of that happening are very small.
But the waters breaking are not a definite sign that the fetus will die?
No. And on the other hand, though, if they came back to her in a day or two and said, look, she says, and she's maybe in her early 20s as her first pregnancy, she says, no, look, I'm not willing to take that chance. I'd like to have a termination of pregnancy. They would then go ahead and do it.
In other jurisdictions?
In other jurisdictions. But we could not do that unless her life is at risk.
So, can I just clarify there, Peter, because I was looking at the Institute of Obstetricians and Gynecologists website today, and they have guidelines for the management of miscarriage in pregnancy.
Not threatened miscarriage, though. That's different, you see. There's an awful lot of confusion about this. Miscarriage, threatened miscarriage, abortion, missed abortion, and so on.
But they do talk about incomplete miscarriages, which we're told is what happened in this case.
That's where the baby has died and the tissues have been passed as the remaining tissue. That's what an incomplete abortion is, and you should know that, Barry.
Yeah, no, but what they're talking about in these guidelines is they say you have conservative management, you have medical induction of labour,
this is talking about really early miscarriage at 6 or 7 weeks, which is just completely different. This is muddying the waters here.
Imagine, Peter, I think perhaps that's not being fair here. I don't think there is anything, from any of the other obstetricians I have talked to, none of them seem to make that tremendous distinction you're making. They've all agreed that
you're not talking to the right people.
Okay, well listen, Barry, let's bring Roger Clemens in here, okay? If I can bring Roger Clemens in from our London studio. Roger, I'm sure you can hear the conversation. How would this case have been managed in England?
Well, just to clear up one point before I answer that question directly, Peter Boylan is absolutely correct. This is nothing like an incomplete abortion. An incomplete abortion is a circumstance in which the fetus has died, has usually been passed, and there are a few bits of the placenta left behind. That's the management of incomplete abortion, and it can be managed conservatively or actively. That is not this case. Okay. Now, if this case had been in my hospital, in my time in practice, assuming that I know the facts, and the facts are that the cervix was dilated, the membranes were ruptured, then we would have had no hesitation in completing that abortion, because with the cervix dilated and the membranes ruptured, there is no chance that this fetus will survive, because to get to viability, this fetus has to survive another 5 or 6 weeks. And with the cervix dilated, it certainly won't do that. Now, that must not be confused with the situation in which the membranes are ruptured, but the cervix is closed. And as Peter has suggested, those cases may go to late in pregnancy and may get a perfectly satisfactory outcome.
As I understand it, Roger Clemens, that is a key question, the dilation. We don't know what the nature of this case was, do we?
No. We don't, except that I'm going on what I've read in the newspapers, which is that the cervix was dilated.
Correct. I think that's a really important point. I mean, I think what's at issue here, yeah, I would agree totally. I think that is a really important point. Going on what we have in the newspapers, and the unfortunate thing about this case is we're all talking about something about which we have only heard one side of the story. We have not heard from any of the doctors in Galway, and yet we are all judging them. We've heard today, basically, in what you're saying is you're judging them and saying they were incorrect in what they did.
Crystal clear until we have the full facts of this case.
And I think that's
we can't
really,
make any meaningful
really
comment
important.
about it.
But yet
what
we
I was
find
referring to are the
ourselves
circumstances of ruptured membranes where the cervix is not dilated.
But here we're told, from what we've been told, is that the cervix was dilated.
Okay, but again, we don't know the full facts.
No, but I think what needs to be clear here, what needs to be clear here is that there is nothing in ethics, there is nothing in law in this country which impedes a doctor from treating this case, be it conservatively, medically, or surgically.
But hang on a second, could a doctor have aborted that fetus while its heart was still beating?
There would have been nothing preventing that doctor from inducing labour.
Okay,
hang on a second. That is absolutely wrong. If the woman's life is not at risk, then if you terminate that pregnancy, you're committing a criminal offence. That's the law.
So, Peter, you would never do that, would you not? You would have handled it the same way as it's reported.
No, I don't want to discuss the individual case in Galway.
No, but in a similar case.
Okay, Barry, let's read.
No, I think this really.
Barry, you're saying that child could have been aborted, that fetus could have been aborted if the heart was still beating, or any fetus could be aborted if the heart was still beating, if it wasn't viable.
If the mother's health is not at risk, if she's not at risk of death.
Hang on a second, Peter. Let's just let Barry clarify exactly what she's saying, and then we'll come back.
What I'm saying is there is nothing in ethics and there is nothing in law in this country which prevents an obstetrician in a case like this where you're presented with a miscarriage. There is nothing that prevents them from treating it in whatever way is best for this particular woman. Otherwise, let's face it, if it was, we would have cases like this happening all over the time. We would have many more maternal deaths happening in this country.
Let's just clarify that.
I think it's important.
Can you conduct an abortion if a cervix is dilated at 17 weeks if the fetal heart is still beating?
If the mother's life is not at risk, you cannot terminate a pregnancy when the baby is alive. There is no argument about that. If the mother's life is at risk, then you can.
Okay, let me go back to Roger Clements in the UK. Roger, if we can move this on, another question to you would be, in the UK you do have abortion. If a woman asks for an abortion at 17 weeks or 14 weeks, you can perform that. However, you still have women who die of infection due to their pregnancies. It wouldn't necessarily have prevented the death here, would it?
Well, it's all a matter of timing. If the infection has already set in, then of course emptying the uterus doesn't necessarily solve the problem. But I'm not aware of any significant numbers of women who die of infection at this stage in pregnancy, because it must be extremely rare. When I was a young doctor, it was very common because we had a lot of criminal abortions that became infected. But I think I'm right in saying that this is an extreme rarity now. It is a matter of timing. If you empty the uterus before the infection starts, then the risk of infection is minimal and you will almost certainly be able to control it. The problem is that the pregnancy is a very good culture medium for the organisms, and if you get an infection in the uterus while the pregnancy is still present, it can be very difficult to control.
Okay, so that's the medicine of it. Billy Keller, if I can bring you in, what is your reaction to how this inquiry has been handled to date?
Well, I think I'm disappointed with the way it's been handled. There should have been further consultation, obviously, with Bhriain, the husband of Savita. I think that it was compromised from the word go in terms of 3 people who were working in the University Hospital Galway, and that's not casting any aspersions or questioning the integrity of the people that were appointed, but clearly it had to be independent. And I think that's the most important thing, that we get to the truth of the matter.
Well, that has been rectified at this point.
It has at this stage. Unfortunately, it has done damage in terms of the fact that the family should have been consulted, and hopefully that there would have been cooperation between the family and the actual inquiry itself. Look, I mean, we're talking about two issues here. There's a very tragic case in Galway, and that has to be fully investigated, and we have to get to the truth of the matter. There is another issue, and that is the report of Justice Sean Ryan that is being reported next week and published next week, and that will inform a broader debate on how we bring clarity to deal with the sensitive issues that are being discussed by Peter O'Berry and by Roger there with regard to giving guidance in a framework that allows obstetricians and clinicians to deal with issues in a way that gives them clarity and support.
Why didn't you bring clarity to this issue? You were in government long
Well, there's
enough.
only three people around this table, and they can't agree. The difficulty is it is very difficult.
But did you try?
We did. We tried in 2002. We tried as best we could to try and bring legal clarity to it based on the X case. The confines of Article 43.3 and the X case interpretation makes it very difficult. And even this evening in the Dáil, there was a debate. But look, I do believe that you have the pro-life, you have the pro-choice, but I believe there's a middle ground that wants to address the issue. They don't want abortion on demand, but they want to make sure that our maternity services are safe and that clinicians have guidance to deal with very difficult issues.
So you do acknowledge this is not easy for any government to do?
Well, it certainly isn't easy for any government, and we have tried to be positive in saying, look, wait for the report, let's have a calm, rational debate and address the other issue with regard to Savita's death, with an independent investigation.
Okay. Barry, Kiely, we're running short on time, but can I ask you your reaction to the revelations around Professor Aral Cumaran this evening and what he has said about abortion?
I'll tell you, I think it's like, again, I certainly don't want to question this man's professional integrity, because I think that would be unfair, and there's been sort of too much of things like that. But I think given the extreme sensitivities around this case, and given the way in which it is being used, whether we like it or not, it is being used by pro-choice, pro-abortion campaigners in a very particular way. I think
but you're not saying he should come off this inquiry, or are you?
I think it's extraordinary that the government wouldn't have taken more care in choosing somebody who would be beyond, if you like, the possibility of being questioned in relation to that.
Barry Kiely, Billy Kelleher, thank you very much indeed, and Roger Crommett in London. Now, in September,